Yeah, hello everybody. Um, we are in this course that we have started the last days to look at the main economic aims, and we started with a look at the aim steady and appropriate growth. There we talked about how do we measure it and in which range for developed countries we see steady and appropriate economic growth. And the second was price stability. And especially when we talked about economic growth, we talked about how do we understand economic growth. And since economic growth will be measured via GDP, and GDP is just the product of prices and quantities. We will, especially during these times, think about only upcoming prices and nothing in production is changing. Then we wouldn't really say that this would be appropriate growth, and therefore we looked for some possibilities how we can rid of these price effect, and this was then done via this chain index for real GDP, where we multiplied the actual production always with the prices of the former year, and through this chaining this also always with the former year, we came to a method that we can get rid of the price effect by measuring our economic performance. And in this case, we also could calculate the so-called GDP deflator. And this GDP deflator then represents the price development in the total economy. So this again, price index, and in a minute we will compare this with the usual inflation rate, which is quite important. Price index represents the whole economy. Yeah. Then we went through some specific example where we calculated the economic growth rate, and after this we went to what we understand by price level stability, and this price level stability is then calculated via the consumer price index. And if we compare this consumer price index here with our GDP deflator, so the GDP deflator comes out of the definition of nominal GDP and real GDP. And the CPI was defined as the arithmetic mean of some representative household. So represents, or here you have it already. And this you have to keep in mind. So also, of course, the preferences of the representative household also change during time. And usually every 5 years we look, are still our weights in this CPI appropriate weights? And then they also will change during time, because of course right now we yeah we consume much more digital products than 15 or 20 years ago. So of course these weights also change during time, and these weights are really set. So we are look always what is an average household consuming, and then we change also these weights, and they are then really set by definition and compared to the GDP deflator here. Oops, where did we have it? Here, especially when we look at nominal GDP and real GDP, there we have prices times quantity. And these prices, they are not set, but we just look at the price development. So here, more or less, the weights for the GDP deflator more or less come out of the economy itself, while if we look at the consumer price index, we just look what is a representative household consuming, and then we talk about do we have to change these weights in the consumer price index. So then we also calculated a little example. Again, we will do this also in exercises. And yeah, then we also can talk about the economy, and in the economy, we of course do not have only the consumer price index and the GDP deflator. So this is relevant for the private consumption. And remember, private consumption represents roughly 55% of GDP. So it is the largest component, but it does not represent the total economy. While the GDP deflator is the index of the whole economy, and this you of course should keep in mind. And what else do we have actually in these times? What is quite important are export and especially for our country, the import prices. And if we look what drives inflation right now, especially in Germany, then we have to say that the main effect is more or less imported inflation, since we have to pay much more for our energy, and these energy prices, they come now more and more and more into our whole economy. So at first we see it when we directly have to pay more for the energy, but if energy becomes if energy becomes more expensive, then of course also the cost calculation within the enterprises will raise, and also then in a second effect we will get from these higher energy prices then also in general higher prices in our economy. So right now inflation is mainly driven by energy prices, which drive total import prices. And what else do we have? Well, we have the wholesale price index for the wholesale trade. So this can also be seen as some indicator which then drives in the end the consumer price index, because these wholesale prices the companies have to pay, and based on these wholesale trade prices they make also their calculation what costs afterwards your liter milk or something else. So these are then other prices in general. These prices will drive in the end the CPI and inflation at all. But now we will have a deeper look in consumer price, in the difference between the consumer price index and the GDP deflator. And for this, we go to the next slide. And here we have the development of the yellow line, GDP deflator in Germany, and inflation, blue line in Germany, since the last roughly 20 years. And what we see in this picture is that, yeah, more or less in general, GDP deflator well, in general, the price development of GDP deflator is below the price development measured by CPI. And what does this mean? Well, in general, you work for a company and you earn some money, and then you see that inflation measured via the CPI is going up. So you can think of that you maybe earn 2,000, 2,500 euros per month. And you see here, due to CPI, which represents the private consumption, the representative household goes up by 2.5%. What do you think then? Well, you say, I'm still working as good as last year. And if prices in general for private consumption go up by 2 or 2.5%, then you would go to your company and say, well, I'm still working as good as before. So I want that you raise my wage by this amount of roughly 2.5%. And this seems reasonable. But then your company says, well, what I'm gaining is based on my cost calculation. And behind this company, you have more or less the total production in your country. So this comes then from this production approach. And then, of course, you have to consider all price developments in your country. But the total price development in your country is represented by the development of the yellow line, by the price development measured via the GDP deflator. So, well, you go to your company and you say, I want to have roughly 2%. And if you go in this situation, then you see here you have maybe roughly a relative change of GDP deflator of only 1%. So if input prices and output prices as a whole will rise only by 1%, then your company will reasonably argue, well, my prices only have risen by 1%. So I can give you only a wage increase of 1%. So workers will look at the price development based on CPI, because this represents the private consumption. Companies will look at the price development based on GDP deflator, because this represents the total economy. And we are producing, of course, for the total economy. And this then means if CPI, price development, so there I will write PD, and, oops, PD price is larger than GDP deflator, price development, then of course we will have frictions in the labor market, because then when you are arguing about your wages, you will have you want to have reasonably 2 or 2.5% higher wages, and your company says, well, my revenue has risen only by 1 or 1.5%, then in this case, you will have a clash between the workers and the companies. Okay?
Is there any reason why the private consumption is in general higher than CPI?
Yeah, well, you have sometimes the reason for this that especially if you look at investment goods or something like this, that you have there, yeah, so to speak, slower increase of prices of these large goods, because these goods doesn't change that fast in their price level compared to your normal small private consumption goods. So, but in general, it is more or less a descriptive point we find in general when we look at the time series, that in general we find that the price development of GDP later is lower. And so from this point, we in general have these frictions in the labor market, because I want more money than the company wants to pay me. But if you look especially here in the time after the financial crisis, let's take another color. Take red. So this was in general. But in the years after financial crisis in Germany, we had a period with GDP, deflator, price development was larger than CPI price development, and this meant no problems at the labor market. And actually, if we go in the years 2010, 2012, 13, 14, 15 or so, then we really didn't found really periods where we had huge problems at the labor market, and that trains are not going, or the planes were not flying or something like this. Because in general, this was the situation, and this was quite an exception, that during this time the whole price effect in the total economy was faster than the price effect in private consumption. Well, and unfortunately, right now, this is changing again. So right now we have inflation rates of about 10%, and the forecast for GDP deflator is roughly about 5, 6, or maybe 7%. And if you have a look at the news, then right now we want to have in some sectors increase of wages of about 10% or something like this. This will also be a problem next year. How is our economy developing when we have these frictions, especially from this aspect here, from the labor market in the next year? Okay.
Are the investments such as stock market or real estate also counted in CPI, or is it like depends on if a natural person, let's say, owns it?
You mean stock market developments?
If you own stocks or
Yeah.
real estate, is that counted in consumer price index, or is it counted as a GDP?
Neither nor. It is not directly, you don't find it directly in the CPI. If you look at the definition of the CPI, this is just your private consumption. Which goods are you buying for consumption? And this is not your investment decision in stocks or something like this. Buying a car is in general for you consumption, but of course, if you look at companies, it could also be an investment good. If a company buys for production these cars, but in general, as if you buy as a private household a car, then it is of course consumption. And in house price index, is it directly entering? No, I don't think so. But I should look it up. But houses are not directly entering the consumer price index. Okay, and in GDP, there of course all what you are producing, and I'm not producing a stock or something like this, no? Yeah. So you have in your circular flow afterwards when you go to your financial institutions, but not when you directly calculate the GDP. But of course, indirectly, stock market developments, of course, then influence the prices of GDP deflator and the prices in the consumer price index. Okay, so, well, let's take another color. Yellow is not a good choice. Blue here. No, blue is also not a good choice. Red we already had, so we'll take green. So this is changing again with CPI price development larger than GDP. Deflator price development. So, and here in a descriptive way, if we look also in a long in the longer history with a long time series, again about 50 years, then quite often it was said, well, before introducing the euro, everything was better, and especially prices were much more stable than after introducing the euro. But if you look at the actual price development during the time before introducing the euro, then on average we had from the 17th until 1999 the introduction date from the euro. We had on average inflation rates of roughly 3.5%, And if we take these 20 years since we have the euro, roughly 20 years since we have the euro, we had these average inflation rates of roughly 1.5%. And even if we look at these very high price developments in the actual month, so this is the monthly inflation rates, then we are reaching here, I think the latest data point is now even 10%. This was the last one, I think, in September. We had 2022, we had roughly 10%. So, of course, we will move up here in the actual situation, but this still means for the average inflation rate during the times with the euro that this was much lower than the average inflation rates during the time when we didn't have the euros. This is sometimes also, yeah, quite fast forgotten that we already had during the 70s, especially during the both oil crisis, also situations with very high inflation rates. But anyhow, we will see how this is developing in the next month or in the next years. And this actually also depends highly what our energy prices will do in the next time. And how much these effects from the energy prices can drive total inflation, for this we will also make a little calculation. So what we see here is the price development, blue line, of CPI. And here you see, in the actual situation, we moved up these up to the number of roughly almost 10%. And of course, within the CPI, we have an energy component. So there are some goods, when we are going to the gas station, then of course, the price of gas is directly entering the CPI. And if we take only these energy goods, which directly enters the CPI, we have here in the orange line the development of the energy component. And there, of course, you see that this energy component is much more volatile than the total price index itself. So, energy component is much more volatile than the total index CPI. Then we can ask the question, what does this mean for total price development? So what we want to calculate is right now the quantitative effect of this high volatility. So we can roughly say the until the actual situation, more or less CPI, the relative development was roughly 1 or 2%. And we see here, even before the war in the Ukraine started, we had a volatility up to 20% and then going down during the financial crisis or during the years 2014 to 2016, that the energy prices came down by minus 10%. So we have roughly plus minus 10, 20% in the development of the energy component. And what does this quantitatively means for total inflation? Saving. And there we first have to have a look, what is the amount of these energy goods in our consumer price index. And there we can say that roughly 10% of CPI is represented by our energy goods. So GI of energy equals roughly 10%. If we go back to our definition here of CPI, here, then this is this weight of this weighted arithmetic mean. So this is for the energy goods roughly 10%. So, and now we go in our actual situation where we had, let's have a look here, energy prices went up by about 40%. And now I want you to calculate inflation based on the assumption that all other prices stay the same and only the energy component goes up by 40%. What would be then inflation of next year? Question?
4% higher.
So, and how do you calculate this?
If the energy prices have risen by 40% and it comes from only 10%, which is 10% of 40%, which would be 4%.
This is a very fast calculation, I would say. Then let's do it a bit slower. So let's take at first, how do we calculate the index? So CPI, there we have 90% non-energy and we have 10% energy. So then we could write our index or CPI at, let's say, time 0. There we would have 0.1, and we come today from our actual price level. And next year it should rise, this energy component, by 40%. So today we just fix our index to 100, like we have done this also in our two other examples, because we are only interested in the relative change in the next year. So the energy component would then 0.1 times 100 plus 0.9 times also 100, and this of course then adds up to 100 in total. So this is the energy component, and this is non-energy. And then CPI in the next period. And as you have already calculated in your head, we have 0.1, still 10%. And this sub-index for energy, what do I have to write here? 140, because this goes up by 40%. And all other prices should stay the same. So I have to write 0.9 times, yep, still 100, because there we assume that nothing changes. And if we put these together, then yes, because here we have 90 and this is 14. So we end up with 104. And then inflation becomes CPI at time t equals 1 minus CPI at time t equals 0 divided by CPI t equals 0, and then we obtain 104 minus 100 divided by 100, and this of course then equals 4 over 100, and you already mentioned it, that we have then 4% inflation. So, well, I did this calculation in this slow manner, of course. You can directly calculate it, calculate this as you have done this, but of course this is, I think, also possible because here I chose really, yeah, easy numbers, so to speak. But in general, if you have, so to speak, much complicated numbers, then you really should know how to do this, and then you just calculate the both indices, and of course, always, if you have something like inflation or the growth rate, then you have to calculate the relative change. Okay. So then, yeah, we are done with the second part of our target system. The magic square here. Oops, there we are. There. So now we have talked about steady and appropriate economic growth, and we have talked about price level stability. So the next one will be our high level employment. We want to talk about today. So what is, of course, the principal aim? The principal aim is to reach full employment. And full employment, we have to distinguish this from the case that everybody is working. Because what do we understand by full employment? We understand by full employment that every person who is willing to work has also a job. And this is quite important because if we have a look at the social system in our developed countries, then of course you get also money if you doesn't work. And then go to your microeconomics courses, you have your own preferences, and then you can decide for your own. And there's no morality in it or something like this. So then in a free democracy, then of course you have the choice. You can say, I want to work, going up every day at 8 o'clock or something like this, and earning maybe 1,000 or 2,000 euros per month, or I'm not doing this, and roughly you can say in Germany you get roughly 1,000 euros per month from the social system. And then it's your own decision, and therefore it's quite important to distinguish what we understand by full employment, that we do not say, okay, this means everybody should have a work, but everybody who is willing to work is in labor. And therefore, when we calculate then the unemployment rate, the unemployment rate is then calculated by all people who could work, not who wants to work, but all people who could work. So this is more or less roughly the people in between 20 and 65 years in a society. And we take all the people who are unemployed relative to this number. This is defined, and we will do it in a minute in more detail. This is then called the unemployment rate. And due to this distinction that we look at persons who are willing to work, we say, especially for Germany, where we have very high social security, that you roughly say, well, we would consider an unemployment rate of roughly 3 or 4% as full employment. Then let's have a look at the development of unemployment during the last 20 years. Then we see in Germany, we come from a very high state here. This was in the beginning of the new millennium. And there, of course, we also have to say that during this time, so until 2005, 2006, we really had an economic crisis in Germany. Very high unemployment rates parallel to an economic crisis in Germany. And then we have until now more or less a situation in Germany which is called also the German miracle in the labor market. Because more or less since then the unemployment rates went down and down and down. This is called the so-called miracle of labor market in Germany, because unemployment rates went down independently from general economic developments. And especially if we look at these times here, 2008, 2009, and here to 2021, what do we see here? Is it surprising for you?
You can see it was a very small spike considering how big the price is.
Yes. So here we have even during financial and Corona crisis, unemployment rates went up only a little bit. And this, of course, we also have to explain later on. So this at the beginning, just a general overview to the development of unemployment in Germany in the last 20 years. Okay, and now we want to define unemployment in detail, because of course only the registered unemployed people then are also relevant, especially also for the public spending, because for them, of course, from unemployment insurance, we have to pay for them. So I already mentioned, in general, we look at people roughly in the age between, oh, not 20, but in the age between 15 and 65. And maybe you know that in Germany we start to raise the retirement age in the next years. And therefore, I wrote here also 67, because I think in 2032, then we have reached this new retirement age of 67. But I think you are also 15, 20 years younger than me. I'm 50 or almost 50, and I think that my retiring age will also not be 67. I suppose it will be 70 or something like this. That we will see how to finance all our social system, and especially how we finance our pensions. And if we look there at the development of our population, especially in the midst of Europe, then I think we will have to work a longer time, and that these raising the retirement age will not stop at 67 in the 2030s. So, but roughly we look at people in the age between 15 and 65, And of course, this is written down in the law, in the social code, book 3. And so unemployed people include all people who are temporarily not employed for work and in a job with fewer than 15 hours per week. So this is also then, a measure where you say when you have a really small job or something like this, then in this case you are also counted as unemployed. Then, of course, it is important that you are really want to have a job. This coincides here with this. You have to be a person who is willing to have a job. Because, of course, I don't know how it is in your families. Maybe your mother or your father just stays at home and only one of the two, your father or your mother, is working and the other one is caring about the family. So these people do not seek a job and therefore they are also not counted in the registered unemployed people. So you have to seek an employment and of course you have in this process to be available for the efforts taken by the employment agencies and these institutions. So in this case, you get every month or every 2 months a phone call or a letter, and they ask you, have you looked for a job? And if you didn't have looked for a job, then they will call you 2 months, the next 2 months. And if you haven't looked for a job the next 4, 5 or 6 months, then at some time you will drop out of the statistic of unemployed people. And of course, you have to go to the unemployment agencies, to the institutions, and you have to say that you are unemployed. We will just see when we take another definition. So this is more or less the official unemployment statistics. But now in economics, of course, we want to compare different countries. And if we go from Germany to France or to UK or to United States, then of course they will have another law. When do they count unemployed people? So we cannot take the definition we have in Germany when you are unemployed and take this definition especially for the United States, because they have a much different law. When do they count unemployed people? And therefore, we have also a general definition which is applied for all countries, and this is from the ILO, and ILO is the International Labor Organization, and you see that this definition differs slightly from the definition, from the official definition in Germany. At first, we say that we look at people in the range between 15 and 74 years. Well, we really want to look at all countries in the whole world. And then, of course, if you go to the developing countries, there you do not have such a pension system like in the developed countries. And there is more or less no real retiring age. So we say then in general, we look at the people until 74 or 75 years when they have to stop. to work because they cannot work anymore. And also you have actually actively seek for a work for the next 4 weeks. Also, you have to be again available for a job. This is again this definition from which we had you a willing person, that you really want to work. And of course, oops, now it's definitely irrelevant if you are a registered person or if you are not a registered person. So quite often we get these statistics by just phone calls of 1,000 people or so in a random sample you take in every countries, and therefore if you have a look for time series or what is the level of unemployment, you sometimes find different numbers for the same country, and the reason is that sometimes you look at the official numbers and sometimes you look at the numbers from the ILO, from the International Labour Organization. And of course, we cannot say that this number is right and this number is wrong. Always you have to look at the numbers in the context. So maybe we can say that this number is relevant for public finance. And if you look only at the economic performance of the country itself, and we take this other measure from the International Labour Organization relevant for international comparisons between countries. So here we had a look in a quite aggregated way at the development of unemployment rates of the average of a year. So this is average per year. And now we take this picture here in more detail, because also we have statistic numbers for unemployment rates every month. And if we look at this pattern, then we see that we have here quite a fluctuation if you look in the period not per year but per month. And we have here more or less something like always the same pattern during a year itself. So if you look at monthly unemployment, we have a repeating pattern of unemployment rates during a year. So actually, if we have a deeper look inside, then we see that in every spring the unemployment rates goes down, and every autumn unemployment rates goes down. Especially unemployment rates go down every spring and every autumn. Well, and this, of course, we also have to explain. And in order to do this, save it. Yep.
Maybe for the spring is that in the summer, maybe seasonal workers are starting to work, or for example, the restaurants have more guests.
Yes.
So space. And for the winter and for the autumn, it could be maybe like Christmas markets, or there's also like work or something.
So for spring, you are actually right that especially if you take the tourist sector, then of course you start to employ people, and people come also in spring, especially to the developed countries to work then seasonally here during the summer months in our countries. Well, if you take the Christmas, then this effect is of course not that large that you would really see this large drop. There we have to take yeah, another explanation, but of course you are totally right. Then we have to look at different types of unemployment, and these different types we there we distinguish at first short term unemployment, and the first one you already mentioned. This is then called the so-called seasonal unemployment, and there of course we have the tourist sector, and of course what you also meant in restaurants, and of course if you look especially at the construction sector, because you are not building houses that much during winter time. So also in this part of uh, the production side, you have a drop every winter time, and then you start in building in the construction sector then also in spring. And we will also talk about the so-called frictional unemployment. And then we have the so-called medium term. This is cyclical unemployment. Here we look at the business cycle, and then of course long-term unemployment, and this we call structural employment. And this is maybe the worst one, because in this case you are not, with your education, you are not matching the labor market anymore, and this is then of course a very bad situation. So short term, what do we mean by short term? This is roughly below 1 year, and the cyclical unemployment, this is then roughly, oops, still saving, in between 1 to 3 years. And structural unemployment then roughly larger than, oops, than 3 years. Okay, then I think we will stop today at this point, because then we will talk next week in more detail about all these types of unemployment, but you have already started with the seasonal component. This we will have also done next week. So thank you very much for today, and